Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Iran at 40. So this is the topic for today, and we have Professor Farideh Farhi to discuss this topic with us. But before that, you were in Latin America just a few days ago. I got back. So how was Latin America, and where did you go?
I went to Argentina, which is hurting quite badly because of the economic downturn and devaluation of Argentinian pesos. So austerity has hit people very badly, but it's Argentina, so people are still into good food and good espresso. So
it was beef. They like beef, huh?
Yes, they do. They do.
Yeah. So good of you to come here, although you are a little bit under the weather. But thank you very much that you were able to do so. I wanted to ask about the significance of Iran at 40, because it's like 40 years since the Islamic Revolution and the establishment of the Republic. So how would you like to begin talking about that?
Well, let me begin by saying that probably the most significant aspect of the Islamic Republic of Iran at 40 is that it still exists, in the sense that since its inception and the revolution of 1979, it has been a country that has been constantly under attack in variety of ways. Of course, in the decade of 1980s, it was the Iran-Iraq War, which was initiated by, at that time, Iraq that was under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, but supported by many different countries in the region, as well as extra-regional players. And then from 1990s onward, effectively, Iran has been under different sanctions regime. They were not probably as harsh as they have been in recent years, but nevertheless, beginning with the Clinton administration, Iran has been under sanctions, economic sanctions, so you could make an argument that it has faced economic war that at least partially initiated by the most significant player in the world, which is the United States. And despite attempts to bring about some sort of change in the structure of the government, what in the United States is called regime change, it has not happened. So that, I think, is the most significant thing that one can say about the Islamic Republic at the age of 40.
Yeah. So you're talking about sanctions. This is rather interesting because those sanctions were like international sanctions, or were they just sanctions by the United States? What's the difference between international UN sanctions and sanctions right now?
There were actually three different sets of sanctions that were directed against Iran. One are sanctions that are effectively against American companies investing in Iran or investing, for example, in the oil sector or importing from the oil sector. So you have sanctions that are directed against Iran, but effectively prevent any kind of interaction, economic interaction between the United States and Iran. Then there are sanctions that are called tertiary sanctions or secondary sanctions, in the sense that the United States sanctions other countries that try to invest in Iran or trade with Iran. And the way it does that is essentially by punishing companies because they have interest in the United States. So, for example, a large oil company like the French Total, if it continues to invest in Iran, then its subsidiaries in the United States will be facing all sorts of punishment. We see, or Chinese, for example, we see an example of that with the Chinese telecommunication company Huawei, which is whose vice president is arrested in Canada for violating American sanctions against Iran. Then eventually, during the Obama administration, actually at the end of the Bush administration, the United States was able to convince the United Nations to impose sanctions on variety of Iranian companies and individuals because of its nuclear program as well as its missile program. However, during the Obama administration, through very intensive process of negotiations that included 5 members of the Security Council as well as Germany, that's why they are called 5+1, and the European Union, 2 years of negotiation led to what is called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, that lifted some of those, certainly lifted the United Nations sanctions, but also suspended some of the American sanctions that had been imposed either through executive order or some of it is congressional, but gives the president the leeway to suspend them. Also on top of that, a resolution was passed, Security Council Resolution 2331, which essentially acknowledged this agreement. It is that agreement that the Trump administration has violated. It has withdrawn, and in the process, it has violated that United Nations Security Council resolution. So United States is back to its previous sanctions that I mentioned, both against American companies that invest in Iran, as well as other European or any other companies that invest in Iran that have some sort of interest in the United States. However, the United Nations sanctions have been lifted, and the Europeans who do not want to abandon the JCPOA, this nuclear agreement, have been trying to figure out different mechanisms so they can continue their trade with Iran. That has been proven a very, very difficult process because of the dominance of United States dollars in international transaction. Because one of the main transactions, one of the main sanctions that is against Iran is precisely in that arena, that companies cannot use American currency to deal with Iran. And it turns out that effectively most of the international transactions, even though they may be transacting in other currency denominations, ultimately they have a stop through American banks or through dollar denominations. So the Europeans have been working since the Trump administration abandoned the JCPOA to create what is called a special purpose vehicle to allow that kind of trade. It has been approved, but
approved by whom?
By the European Union, by various countries. It is located in Europe, but its process of going beyond merely humanitarian exchange, for food and medicine, it hasn't been able to get off the ground easily because the Europeans do not know how to get around. But eventually, the Chinese and the Russians and all the other countries who do want to trade with Iran will plan to participate in this process. How long it will take, I do not know.
Yeah, this is interesting. So several questions. One is like in terms of 2331 resolution, UN Security Council, right? U.S. is violating that.
Exactly.
So what does that mean? I mean,
nothing. I mean, as you know, many countries, there are United States, UN Security Council resolutions that are constantly violated by countries as varied as Turkey to Israel, and now United States itself is part of that process, not heeding it eventually, even though United States itself during the Obama administration was the main party in the negotiations that led to 2331. So Iran remains within JCPOA, a UN body, United Nations what is called IAEA, the Atomic and International Atomic Energy Agency, has confirmed continuously several
Recently,
times.
like a week ago or something.
Exactly,
Yeah.
for the, I don't know, seventh or eighth time that Iran remains true to its obligations. It is the United States that has withdrawn, and of course the Europeans, because they are unable to get around this very, very strong, determined effort on the part of United States to pressure European countries, have also not been able to fulfill their commitment, which is to abandon the sanction regime that has been imposed on Iran.
Yeah, let me continue in this train of questions and comments. I mean, these things about the sanctions, before we go into, all the things behind it, the political issues. Okay, so you have, like, for instance, China. Yeah? Because of the transaction regime that passes through American banks, the SWIFT, so-called SWIFT regime, everything has to go through dollars at one point or another, and therefore, companies would be penalized. You mentioned Total, the French one. We can mention others, but that is sufficient for now. But then you have, like, Europe. There are huge, for instance, transnational corporations, German, located in Germany, based, that would lose billions of dollars in terms of investment and trade and so forth with the United States. So they wouldn't do that.
Exactly.
But they're trying now to, the Germans, trying to have, like, different entities or other companies that don't do much or at all, or don't do anything at all with the U.S., to do relations with Iran, because that's good for the German economy. So that's one thing they are pursuing. To what extent, now we don't know. But the other thing is China. China is a huge economy, right? And, what is it, 1.3 billion people, whatever. There are Chinese corporations that only deal in China, in the domestic market. These don't care. They can do that. So there is a way then, and to what extent is that way possible,
Yes,
to do that?
It is possible, and it was done in the past, but the Chinese also benefit from that process, because they essentially, for example, during the Obama administration, when, for example, there was a very similar, very tight sanction regime imposed, there was a Chinese bank that effectively, specifically was designed to allow for those kind of interactions. But what the Chinese did was essentially to keep Iranian money in the Chinese banks. The Indians did the same thing. And it took, once the JCPOA was signed, it took several years before actually these banks gave the Iranians the money. That it was Iranian money, but held in these banks for future or any kind of economic activity. So it's not, the setup, there is no doubt that the Iranians are able to get around the sanction regime in variety of ways. For example,
through Turkey,
not only through Turkey, but now the most important trade partner of Iran after China is Iraq. Okay, and the Iraqis have made clear that to the Trump administration, that it's very difficult for them to follow through with the sanctions regime, for example, because a large part of the Iraqi electricity comes through Iranian electrical grid. So that kind of dynamic is very much at play. And of course, there is also the question of oil prices. Initially, when Mr. Trump came up with this idea of rejecting the JCPOA, his intention was that by November 2018, United States would force the export of Iranian oil to zero. But had that happened, then oil prices would have gone up tremendously. So what they did in November, despite the arguments to the contrary prior to that, by November they gave 8 countries exceptions, including Japan, Korea, as well as a couple of European, China, to import Iranian oil. So Iranian export of oil has decreased dramatically from, let us say, 2.8 million barrels a day, including condensates, to less than 1.5 million, even at times close to 1 million a day. But nevertheless, the Iranians are still exporting oil. But the question of how to get the money back from the export of oil is a very, very tricky business.
Yeah, because of what you mentioned, like with the Indians and so on. Yeah.
Exactly.
But also, like Iran, I mentioned Turkey, you mentioned Iraq, of course, especially with the grid, electric grid is very important, and a lot of other connections.
Of course, food, all sorts of. Iran exports quite a bit to Iraq. Yeah.
Because Iran, okay, I'll ask this question now then. Iran, over like, let's say, 35 years of sanctions, for instance, and before that war had started in 1980, September 1980. They were under tremendous pressure, etc., and yet they have been able to develop technologically, etc., and to manufacture, like, a good manufacturing sector. I mean, as a third world country, of course. So to what extent did the sanctions help Iran develop those kinds of things, and to what extent it hindered it from maybe doing it even more? I mean, what you think of that?
It's a difficult question to answer. Iran is a middle income country of the South. So it has, I think its economy is 18th or 19th largest in the world. And if you go and look at the data that has been offered by the World Bank, and you do not only consider gross national product and consider quality of life in terms of improvement of life, in terms of increase in life expectancy, healthcare system, you will see that Iran essentially is ahead of almost every other country in a similar position. Because after all, the Iranian Revolution had certain redistributive capabilities or desires. And you can see that in terms of what has happened, in terms of quality of life in Iran. However, in terms of economic denominators, certainly at the time of revolution, countries like Turkey or South Korea, other middle-income countries, Iran was ahead of them in some important way. Some important indicators like the gross national product or per capita income, and it has fallen behind in those categories. Those countries have entered the global market in full force, like Turkey has. They have borrowed heavily. Okay, so country like Turkey or Argentina or even Brazil are heavily indebted, and the other side of it is that they have tremendous amount of foreign investment. Iran has not had any. It is not an indebted country. It barely has any foreign debt. Both because there has been debate inside Iran not to borrow, but also because nobody lends to Iran. So that has had consequences in terms of these general economic indicators. So these sanctions harm Iran in very important ways. For example, sure, Iran has one of the largest auto industries, certainly the largest in the Middle East, and one of the largest in the world. But it's done that in cooperation with, for example, French companies, Renault, as well as Peugeot. and they left Iran when Obama sanctions came in. They came back, okay, and when the sanctions were lifted, again they have left Iran. So Iran, the auto industry, faces serious issues in terms of parts as well as inefficiencies that part of that domestic production. So it's very difficult to answer the question because we do not know what the other path would have been.
Exactly.
Exactly. So, and you know, obviously, you also are faced with a country that had a very disruptive event, which was a revolution. Then an 8-year war, again, an extremely disruptive event, and then sanctions. So, you know, the question of, there is no doubt that that has given Iran quite a bit of domestic capabilities. It has had to run its oil industry on its own without any international capital, and it has managed to produce, it has managed to export quite a bit. Not as much as it managed to do right before the revolution, but nevertheless, the oil industry has not, you know, died. But nevertheless, the question of whether or not the potential in terms of pure economic productivity would have been better fulfilled had there been international capital is always a question that the Iranians themselves ask, and there is tremendous amount of debate about it. There is a group of Iranians among the leadership that wants more international capital, and there is another that focuses on the economy of resistance. But that debate is essentially taken care of because when international capital is not allowed to go to Iran, then
it's moot.
It's a moot debate inside the country.
Yeah, right. But, you know, if you look at a number of indicators in terms of education, PhDs, you know, all of that, industry like artificial intelligence is highly developed in Iran. I mean, regardless of whether, you know, the sanctions or no sanctions or whatever, the fact of the matter there is, I mean, it's one of the top people in, I mean, countries in artificial intelligence. And this is not an easy thing.
Not only that, but also, I mean, if you look at, for example, if the argument that is made by the Iranians that the nuclear industry is a homegrown industry, and they manage, Iran is one of the few countries that managed to enrich uranium on its own without the help of outsiders,
That's
you know.
huge,
So that was part of the argument that was always made by the Iranians in rejecting the argument that Iran's nuclear program should completely shut down because it was seen as a program that was part of that scientific move on the other hand. So it's true in terms of biotech, in terms of, you know, Iran is considered to be by United States a major source of cyber war against United States, along with China and Russia, you could make an argument. And of course, it has developed a very robust indigenous missile industry, which, you know, part of the American objection to the nuclear agreement was that it did not address Iran's missile program. Of course, the Iranians argue that that's part of the Iranian defense system. And since Iran effectively does not have an air force, you know, that's the other side of it, that despite all this indigenous activities, it hasn't been able, for example, to build sufficiently robust airplanes. That
recently they had one or two,
yes,
but
they're
not
very
as
small. And in terms of
I've seen them, and
yes, but in terms of its commercial fleet, for example, is completely dependent, and that has been under sanctions, not under Trump, not under Obama, since you know,
the
since
beginning,
since the Clinton administration. So that kind of dynamic obviously prevents, excuse me, the kind of development that you know, might have been considered. But in terms of other indicators, as you suggested, for example, you compare that female education, for example, women's education since the revolution, you know, is not even comparable. Almost 80,
yeah,
90%
right.
of women are educated in Iran, are not illiterate anymore. So, and the numbers are close between men and women. So, university education, there was an expansion, not necessarily good education,
Well,
but
but the university education.
yes, exactly.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, when I was artificial intelligence, stem cell research too. I mean,
Exactly.
you think like Islamic Republic stem cell, where there is like, positions here in the United States about stem cell research, you shouldn't do it, It's fascinating, that kind of thing. So it gives you a different idea from what maybe the stereotype or the stereotypical idea about Iran is when you hear of all those kinds of things. In terms of the nuclear regime in Iran and the under Obama, they always, before that, they always wanted to have like to talk about other issues than the nuclear program, the Iranian nuclear program. And the Iranians said no. I mean, you want to talk about the nuclear program? Let's talk about the nuclear program. Don't bring like Syria or anything else into the picture. Don't bring the rockets into the picture. We can talk about that later, but not now. Let's do the nuclear situation. And Obama, not because he loved Iran, he did that, but because he figured out what's the alternative, he asked himself. And the alternative would have been something very bad, war or committing U.S. troops, perhaps, or some other fashion of, sanctions that would not compel Iran to go beyond 5% enrichment. It could go up to 20 or maybe more, and that would make it bring it closer to, theoretically at least, have the nuclear bomb. And so it was between this or that. They figured out, well, we can contain them at least for 10 years, 15 years before things might happen. So, but enter the dragon, Mr. Trump, and that's what happened, right?
Not only that, Mr. Trump comes with people who are avid regime changers in Iran. Secretary of State Pompeo, as well as National Security Advisor John Bolton.
And Elliot Abrams.
Abrams' portfolio is Latin America.
Oh, yeah, that's
He's
right.
perfect.
But I mean the same mentality.
Yes, but in fact, John Bolton last year went to an opposition meeting in Paris, held in Paris. Iranian opposition. This particular opposition is more like a cult, and they hold yearly meetings.
Fidai Khalq?
No, they are called Mujahideen.
Mujahideen Khalq, sorry, not Fidai. Fidai is the other one, sorry.
Yeah. So they're sort of like a cult, and they are supported by Saudi Arabia. They are funded by Saudi Arabia, essentially. And he went there and he said in 2019, we shall be in Iran, So now he has promised, I mean, literally, if you go to the State Department website, you see that, for example, at the 40th anniversary, they make comments that are very, very antagonistic towards the current regime in Iran and effectively call for some sort of a regime change. So we are back into a situation that you described, that Obama first. Actually, it began with the George Bush administration, at the end of the George Bush administration. United States had argued that Iran should not have any kind of enrichment in Iran, zero enrichment. By the end of the Bush administration, not only it changed its position on regime change, and stated publicly that the United States was no longer interested in regime change, but it also said, it gave hints that it was willing to accept a degree of enrichment in Iran, which the Obama administration built on, and it took 2 years of negotiation. It allows Iran to enrich uranium, but it puts limitations on the program in such a way that Iran would not be able to to be what is called capable to build a nuclear weapon, at least for a while. So now, with the withdrawal from the JCPOA, we are back in the same position, on top of the fact that we have people that are very antagonistic. So the question of where is the end game, because the Iranians are not going to, give in, okay? And the question of what is the Trump administration's end game, and whether or not, if the Iranians make a decision that to withdraw from the JCPOA and go back to their nuclear program the way it was and begin enriching 20% and even beyond more, whether or not the Trump administration is willing to go. What is it going to do? Is it willing to go to war? Does it want to go to war? Is that the intention, to sort of goad Iran into an antagonistic position so they could, attack Iran? Those are all questions that are up in the air. The Iranians have not responded to the Trump administration in kind. That is to say, instead of withdrawing, because the United States is the most important actor in sanctioning Iran, instead of withdrawing from the JCPOA, the Iranians have remained in JCPOA and have asked the Europeans to counter the United States. The Europeans have tried to do so, but they have done so very meekly, to the point that this week the Foreign Minister of Iran and others essentially threatened the Europeans that our patience is running out. So the question remains, what if Iran also withdraws and begins or restarts its nuclear program, or engages in activities that the United States has identified as detrimental to U.S. presence in the Middle East? Again, starts testing its missiles, increases the ranges of its missiles, and all sorts of activities. The question then becomes, what is the Trump administration's endgame? There doesn't seem to be one. United States has increased its activities through its variety of programs, funding of the opposition groups. They are hoping that through the sanction regime and making the Iranian economic life difficult, that eventually the Iranian population will rise against the Islamic Republic. The problem is that the Iranian population has seen examples of what happens. They have seen the example of American invasion in Iraq. They have also seen the example of what has happened in Syria, which was a civil war. Or Libya. And of course, the example of what is happening in Venezuela also, where they are not, which is threatening some sort of a civil war again in Venezuela. So they are not interested. They have not shown. A good part of the population is quite unhappy with the Islamic Republic. Both for economic reasons, but also for political and cultural reasons.
Look at the alternative.
But after, had all of these things had happened before Iraq, maybe they would have been much more interested in trying to see the kind of support they could get from United States in rising again. But after what has happened in the region since 2003, they just, even as I said, the people who are opposed to the Islamic Republic because they are secular, it undermines their cultural lifestyles and so on, and is quite repressive politically, they are not interested. They have not shown an interest in rising up.
Like on Mujahideen Khalq, I made a mistake, like Fidai Khalq, where the left wing during the Shah. And Mujahideen Khalq were there and fighting against the Shah at that to some point. But then they were based in Iraq when Saddam Hussein was at. And then they took a part in the attack against the Iranian Republic in 1980.
They, and then after the American invasion, for a long period of time, This group, which Bolton went to talk to for a
Yes,
long
I've seen
period
him
of
there,
time,
yeah.
as well as Rudy Giuliani
Yeah,
and
yeah,
others,
yeah.
for a long time was considered a terrorist group in the United
Yeah.
States because it killed Americans in Iran prior to the
Right, prior to the
revolution.
revolution, yeah.
Okay, but it was taken off the terrorist list in recent years during the Obama administration. And it was in Iraq in a camp called Camp Liberty. The Iraqis did not want them because they cooperated with Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, after
now,
that, yeah.
they, you know where they are now? They are in Albania. They have been taken to Albania, causing a whole bunch of trouble for the Albanian government. But their political leader is, the main political leader, the husband. We don't know if he's dead or not.
Yeah.
Okay,
But she's now the leader.
She is based in Paris, and Madame Rajavi, and she's the one that folks like Bolton, Giuliani, a whole array of American officials go to speak to in their convention, essentially because I think there was an investigation that John Bolton was paid something close to $180,000 in variety of years to speak to them, because that's where the money comes from the Saudis. So
they have lots of money, but not
they have
so
lots
much
of money
these days.
And when they bring, when you look at their conventions, the number of individuals that can be identified as Iranian are actually quite few. They pay a whole lot of people coming from Eastern Europe, from a variety of immigrant communities, to fill
Well, some of the Mujahid, no, sorry, go ahead.
No, they get paid to be
there. Sure. Mujahideen Khalq, some of them went all over Europe, including Sweden and all of that.
So absolutely. And of course, there is now also an attempt to support the son of the deposed Shah, who is based in Washington. See, the Iranian opposition, unfortunately, I mean, for the Americans who are trying for to develop some sort of an opposition to the Iranian regime, is that they haven't been able to find a viable opposition, because there are lots of opposition groups in the United States, as well as Europe. It's just the problem is that they do not get along. So it's a very bickering kind, and it's just really not serious opposition to the Islamic Republic, even though the number of Iranians who are in exile is quite large.
But not organized. And but it's like this with the son, Shah's son, it's a lame plan, if there is such a plan. And it reminds me of like the mummy regime, resurrect the mummy, it's not gonna happen. I mean, but I wanted to say, like, even in the midst of the harshest sanctions, there were a lot of European luxury items coming into Iran. So explain that.
Iran is an oil-producing country, so so there is sufficient amount of money. The United Arab Emirates, particularly Dubai, worked as a spot that would allow that kind of transition. When you have a sanction regime, you end up having mediators that essentially operate within the context of this sanction regime. And those mediators are essentially the most powerful economically in Iran. So there's a lot of corruption involved. The Revolutionary Guards themselves, presumably had their own ports that brought in a lot of luxury stuff that, because you end up sanctions, those kind of economic sanctions are sources of tremendous amount of corruption and black market in every country. It not only leads to corruption in Iran, it also leads to corruption in Turkey, it leads to corruption in Iraq, it leads to corruption in Europe, because, all these people have to operate in shade, and there is money to be made because of the sanction regime.
Yeah, so the question then becomes the sanctions. Whom do they hurt, the people or regimes? And I'm looking at this. I once, a long time ago, read a few books on sanctions, you know, like against Libya, before Sudan, and all of that. And the outcome, you know, basically of those books is that sanctions don't work ultimately. I mean, they hurt, yeah, but who do they hurt? I mean, it's not the regime. Like Saddam Hussein was under sanctions. He had his palaces and food and the rest of it, but the people were suffering. So what does
Essentially,
that
it
say?
forces the people to become a hostage to protectors. And who are the protectors in this? Or, you know, it's actually the state, the government, or members of that state that become the mediator in protecting the people against, presumably, the sanction regime. So they become rich, they benefit from it, and ultimately it is, you know, it is the people who suffer. Now, in United States, there has been an argument from the beginning that these coercive sanctions, and they are called coercive sanctions, should be directed sanctions. That is to say, they should be directed towards institutions and individuals that the United States doesn't like. So the Revolutionary Guards, the office of the Supreme Leader, whatever. But the point is that, first of all, it's very difficult to separate the way those institutions operate, because they also, you know, it is true that they are forces of repression in Iran, but they are also, Iran is also, the Iranian state is also a large welfare state in the way that this oil money that is coming in, or the money that is somehow distributed inside the country.
Like Saudi Arabia, for instance.
Exactly. Secondly, although the Iranian population is larger, so the amount of distribution towards each individual is smaller, and also United States sanction regime is not directed sanction regime. It is the most vicious sanction regime ever instituted against. It's all comprehensive. It is, had there not been because of this imposition on the dollar, use of dollar, it is even practiced in relationship to medicine, food, because companies who send medicine in Iran have no way of getting back their money. Or food. The United States claims that its sanction regime is not, you know, it has a humanitarian backdoor, but it really doesn't. So presumably it is the Europeans that are, through these special vehicles, financial vehicles, are trying to create a humanitarian backdoor that is having a very, very difficult time. This is on top of the fact, by the way, that United States has also instituted what is the so-called Muslim ban, which is effectively a ban against any Iranian coming to United States. Okay, because the largest number of group of people that benefited from that are part of that Muslim ban and used to immigrate to United States or travel to United States were Iranians. So the Iranian population is completely under the sanction regime. So technically, its life has, you know, it's become totally undermined, economic life, by this very, very heavy noose that is becoming tightened and tightened. And the population also has no way of, you know, leaving Iran to, you know, to improve, individual Iranians to come to United States to improve their lives. So, you know, it's a complete plan, I would argue, project against the Iranian population, based on the premise that, you know, if you want to improve your own lives, then you have to go and engage in a revolt against the government. You should go into the street and get rid of this government. And once you have a new government that, you know, is a government that we like, then we take these noose off. as I said, if it was a pre-2003 Middle East, I think the Iranians would may buy that
Probably,
argument.
yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
They would. But today,
Yeah.
they feel like they are caught
Yeah.
in a situation that they have no control over. They cannot move forward. They cannot move backward. They are completely boxed in. And boxed in, they feel, in a cooperative arrangement between United States hardliners and the Iranian hardliners, who are benefiting from the sanction regime because they are the mediators of this sanction regime.
Yeah. So, in fact, we might conclude something like the U.S. has been involved in constructing foolish policies that didn't work. I mean, if you have like a strategic goal, if the U.S. has a strategic goal serving its own interests, say in the Middle East, you look at the invasion of Iraq, 2003, the attack on Syria, sanctions on Iran from long time ago, and you can go on, but I will stop here for those matters. It's it didn't the U.S. could not affect its strategic goal so far.
Unless you say United States strategic goal is creative chaos in order to sell its arms to countries that can. Unless you say that, but in terms of the implications of its activities, it does not make sense.
Yeah, that's right.
And why the United States, would want, for example, instability in Iraq. Let us say the United States is successful, in convincing the Iranians to rise up against the regime. Let's say the Iranians do that. Now, the reality of Iran is that the Iranian regime does have some public support. I mean, it has created a dynamic where people who were left out of development process have become economically better off. It has a military, it has a system, it has a group of people that are its supporters.
State institutions.
Yes, and these people don't have anywhere else to go. So these people, if there is an attempt to change that system, through a variety of means, will respond through force. So you will have a civil war in Iran. Regime change sounds wonderful on paper, but it's not
for
something.
The US, for the US.
Well, but in any case, as we learned, even in the case of Iraq, where the invasion was very short period of time, and there was indeed regime change in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
You know how many years it has taken to
and how many Iraqis died.
Exactly, and still, so it's not something that happens overnight. There is going to be a civil war in Iran. There is going to be chaos in Iran. The implications of that are that there's going to be a lot of Iranians who would be holding their bags on their, behind their back, moving towards
millions to Europe.
Exactly. So, that's why the Europeans, are very adamant that the nuclear agreement is an important component of peace and security in the world, not only in the Middle East. They just don't have the wherewithals and mechanism to withstand the kind of onslaught that has happened because of the Trump administration.
Yeah, I mean, the Americans began with this, at least publicly, with this creative chaos in Lebanon in 2006.
Exactly.
Condoleezza Rice, talking about like, oh, it's the birth pangs of a new Middle East, this creative chaos, etc. But we know what it did to Lebanon, and then the main instrument in implementing that creative chaos to come up with the regime change, etc., almost everywhere in the Arab world and in Iran, didn't work out because, the main instrument was the State of Israel in Palestine, and it was defeated in Lebanon. Israel was defeated. So, but the thing is that in terms of strategic goal, yeah, some people say it's like the chaos that they want, etc. I don't think that's what they want, only because they're thinking globally, right? China, Iran, and the encirclement of China, and then Russia, and all of that. So far, what we have done because of these foolish policies, you have now more influence for the Russian Federation in the Middle East and less influence, U.S. influence in the Middle East because of these foolish policies. I mean, that's an interesting thing. So I'm wondering, I usually think about that. Who in the world is doing U.S. policy and strategy global? I mean, and the Middle East, is centered to that global strategy. I mean, if there's some such thing. So that is a question. I mean, who is doing these things that haven't worked so far? You see. So, any comment?
Well, what we do know is that there is tremendous disagreement in Washington over not only strategy but also tactics. I mean, that essentially what has become part of the Washington dynamics. So during the Obama administration, Obama had a clearer vision that United States involvement in the Middle East was something that needs to be reduced because, from his point of view, China was the rising power, and therefore United States needed to give much more attention to the Chinese question than the Middle East question. And his major crime at that time was essentially to come and actually say in an interview that the Saudis have to learn to live with an Iran that is not going to go away, in a sense going back to the notion of some sort of a balance of power in the Middle East, as opposed to American foreign policy only being determined in the Middle East by the Saudis or the Israelis. And
let me interject something. And by that, he teed off the state of Israel, who wanted to get rid of Iran.
Exactly. Yeah. But Israelis and the Iranians, have their own dynamic that is. But the point is that there was an attempt to understand the situation in the Middle East, but at the same time, he was in very important ways unable to pursue. In fact, he pursued also contradictory policies. For example, supporting the Saudi onslaught against Yemen. Okay. Or supporting, at least for a good period of time, the creation of opposition group against the Assad government. It was Obama that said Assad must go, but then at some point realized United States does not have the means or is not willing to put on the table.
They were terrorists. I mean, that they supported basically, and sometimes they didn't know they were terrorists.
Well, they changed. But
well, I mean,
exactly. No, but that's why the Iranians or others or Assad claim that the origins of ISIS must be found in American foreign policy or in United States in general. But whether that's true or not, the point is that even Obama, who understood that United States, the importance of the Middle East to American foreign policy is in the process of being reduced because United States is no longer dependent as much to the Middle Eastern oil. Itself is about to become an exporter of oil. And the control of flow of oil is not necessarily to the vital interest of United States and wanted to look elsewhere. His own policies, because of the way United States foreign policy is conducted with variety of interest groups, pressuring and forming United States foreign policy, was unable to pursue a consistent policy. His only consistent policy was an agreement with Iran over the nuclear program, and it was something that was undermined because there were so many people who were opposed to that idea.
So far we've been talking about sanctions and some of the politics around it, and that what the U.S. would do, and how like Iran might respond, and so forth. But the question is, why should the United States, get involved in regime changes all over the place? In Libya.
United States is an exceptional country, and it's a global.
No, yeah, because I mean, in terms of like a lot of these things were against international law. I mean, that's the thing. So one has to look at that. Why should the United States be the policeman of the world, et cetera, et cetera? So that's an important question. We would answer this, I mean, at some future, program here. But the back to Iran now. Yeah, I mean, the Iranians so far have been engaged in certain activities in the Middle East to counter that onslaught against them. You see, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and so forth. And another thing I want to say, like with the Afghan 2001, right after 9/11, in October 2001, the Iranians played an important role in making sure, like, the U.S. invasion would take place with as efficiently as possible, especially in terms of the Northern Alliance in the north of Afghanistan, where Iran had a lot of influence. And so Iran helped the U.S. control.
They cooperated on the ground.
In Iraq.
On Iran. In Iraq, they did not cooperate.
Well,
part of that had to do with the experience of, because during the Bush administration, this is what happened. Iran cooperated on the ground. Iranian military officers cooperated with American military officers, and then Iranian diplomats cooperated with American diplomats to help write the Afghan constitution post-invasion. So it was a very clear, this was during the reformist government of Mohammad Khatami. But United States, for reasons, very complicated reasons, but nevertheless broke off that relationship. And because the Iranians and the Americans were negotiating during the Bush administration in Geneva. And it was United States that broke that relationship off and accused Iran of being part of axis of evil. This was after, this was the famous axis of evil speech by the Bush administration, which is not exactly clear, again, why it came about at that particular moment. So when United States invaded Iraq, Iranians did not cooperate, but because they had very close relationship with Iraqi opposition, they managed to maintain quite a bit of influence.
Right, but in certain times, like against ISIS, etc., the Iranians helped, protect, on the ground in Iraq. I mean, that is an important thing. Now the Iranians are helping with the Taliban negotiations, so that the U.S. can go out of, or withdraw from Afghanistan. So it is an interesting thing. So like this kind of American, shall we say, policy, for instance, pragmatic policy, pragmatism, is not working because it giving it a lot of contradictions. But anyway, we're flat out of time now. But we shall continue soon, perhaps, about those other questions that we couldn't get to. Thank you very much for coming over, Faride, and thank you very much. Mahalo nui loa, and aloha. See you next month. Aloha.